Close your eyes and imagine a world where every knock on the door might be death itself, where a mother's touch could kill her child, where entire villages fell silent in a matter of days, and no one knew why. In the autumn of 1347, 12 Genoese merchant ships docked in the harbor of Messina, Sicily. They had sailed from the Black Sea, carrying precious cargo from the distant east, silks, spices, and stories of exotic lands beyond the horizon. But they carried something else, something invisible, something that would change the course of human history. Most of the sailors were already dead, their bodies covered in grotesque black swellings. Those still breathing were delirious with fever, coughing blood onto the deck. The harbor authorities, horrified, ordered the ships away. But it was already too late. Within days, people in Messina began falling ill. The symptoms were unlike anything physicians had ever seen. Dark buboes the size of eggs appeared in the groin and armpits. Victims burned with fever, their skin turning black with subcutaneous bleeding. Most died within 3 to 7 days. Some didn't survive the first night. This was the beginning of the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in human history. Over the next 5 years, it would kill between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. In some villages, every single person perished. In cities, bodies piled so high they had to be burned in mass pyres. Entire families vanished in a week. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It killed the medieval world itself. The feudal system that had endured for centuries began to crumble. The church's authority was shaken to its core. Ancient trade routes fell silent. Entire professions disappeared. Fields returned to wilderness. Yet, from this unimaginable darkness, something unexpected emerged. The world that rose from the ashes was different, freer in some ways, more questioning, more human. The Renaissance, with its explosion of art and learning, grew from soil fertilized by plague. Modern medicine was born from desperate attempts to understand the incomprehensible. Tonight, we'll walk through that dark time together. We'll explore the origins of the plague, the desperate attempts to fight it, and the profound ways it changed civilization. We'll remember not just the tragedy, but the resilience, the human capacity to endure, to adapt, and ultimately, to hope. So, settle in. Let the weight of your day fall away. We're traveling back to a time when the world stood on the edge of oblivion, and somehow, against all odds, survived. This is the story of the Black Death. The story of the Black Death begins not in Europe, but in the vast steppes of Central Asia, sometime in the 1330s. There, among the great grasslands where Mongol horsemen ruled and merchants traveled the ancient Silk Road, a disease stirred in the colonies of marmots and rats. The plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, though no one would know its name for another 6 centuries, lived naturally in the rodent populations of Asia fleas fed on infected animals, carrying the bacteria in their guts. And when those animals died, the fleas, desperate for a new host, turned to whatever warm-blooded creature was nearest. For centuries, the plague had existed in this balance, cycling through animal populations, occasionally jumping to humans, but never spreading far. The nomadic tribes of the steppes had learned to avoid plague-ridden areas. They saw the warning signs: dead rats littering the ground, marmots stumbling in the open, acting strange before they died. But something changed in the 1330s. Perhaps it was climate, a period of cooler, wetter weather that forced plague-bearing rodents to seek shelter near human settlements. Perhaps it was the Mongol expansion, which had created unprecedented trade networks connecting east and west. Or perhaps it was simply the random tragedy of evolution, a mutation that made the bacterium more virulent, more transmissible, more deadly. Whatever the cause, the plague began moving. It spread along trade routes, carried by merchants, soldiers, and refugees. By 1338, it had reached Lake Issyk-Kul in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. Nestorian Christian gravestone records show an unusual spike in deaths that year, with inscriptions mentioning a pestilence. The disease traveled west with the caravans, moving along the Silk Road like an invisible rider. It reached the cities of the Golden Horde, the western portion of the Mongol Empire. Sarai, the great capital on the Volga River, was struck in 1346. Chronicles mention entire households dying, markets closing, the dead lying unburied in the streets. From there, it was only a matter of time before the plague reached the Mediterranean. In 1346, the Mongol army besieged Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula. The city was wealthy, a crucial link in the trade network that brought Eastern goods to Western markets. Behind its high walls, Genoese merchants waited, confident their fortifications would hold. But then the plague arrived in the Mongol camp. Soldiers began dying by the hundreds, then thousands. The siege faltered as the army was ravaged by disease. Dead bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. And then, according to the chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, the Mongol commander made a decision that would doom millions. In a final act of biological warfare, perhaps the first in recorded history, he ordered his men to load the plague-ridden corpses onto catapults and hurl them over the city walls. Whether this act actually transmitted the disease, or whether rats and fleas were already crossing the walls, we can't know with certainty. What we do know is that plague broke out inside Kaffa. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. The Genoese merchants, desperate to escape, boarded their ships and set sail for home. Whether this act actually transmitted the disease, or whether rats and fleas were already crossing the walls, we can't know with certainty. What we do know is that plague broke out inside Kaffa. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. The Genoese merchants, desperate to escape, boarded their ships and set sail for home. They didn't realize they were carrying death with them. In the close quarters of the ships, amid bales of silk and sacks of grain, rats scurried and fleas hopped. Sailors began falling ill mid-voyage. Some ships arrived with entire crews dead or dying, ghostly vessels that drifted into harbors propelled only by wind and current. 12 of these ships reached Messina in October 1347. The harbor authorities, seeing the dying sailors, tried to turn them away. But by then, the rats had already scurried down the mooring ropes. The fleas had already found new hosts among the dock workers and merchants crowding the wharves. Within days, Messina was overwhelmed. Physicians had no explanation and no cure. Families fled, spreading the disease to neighboring towns. By December, half of Sicily was infected. The plague had reached Europe, and there was no stopping it now. From Sicily, it spread like wildfire through Italy. Pisa, Genoa, Venice, the great maritime republics that had built their wealth on trade, now found their harbors bringing death. By January 1348, the plague had reached Florence, where it would claim the lives of perhaps 60,000 souls, inspiring Giovanni Boccaccio to write his famous Decameron, a collection of stories told by young nobles fleeing the plague-ridden city. The disease followed trade routes with terrifying efficiency. Marseille fell in January 1348. From there, it spread along the Rhone Valley and across to Spain. By summer, it had reached Paris, the intellectual heart of Christendom. By autumn, it was in England, first in the southern ports, then moving inland like a rising tide. Everywhere it touched, civilization shuddered. Markets closed, crops rotted in fields. The machinery of daily life ground to a halt as people faced an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't fight. And this was only the beginning. The Black Death came in 3 terrifying forms, each more deadly than the last. The most common was bubonic plague, named for the buboes, swollen, painful lymph nodes that appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck. These swellings could grow to the size of a fist, hard and black, filled with pus and blood. The pain was excruciating. Victims couldn't move without agony, couldn't sleep, couldn't think. Along with the buboes came burning fever. Victims became delirious, crying out in languages no one understood, seeing visions of death and demons. Their skin sometimes turned black with subcutaneous bleeding, giving the disease its name. The Black Death, La Peste Noire, Der Schwarze Tod. If the buboes were lanced and drained, and if the victim was strong, there was perhaps a 30% chance of survival, but most weren't strong enough. Most died within 5 to 7 days, their bodies racked with fever, their minds already gone. Then there was pneumonic plague. This form attacked the lungs directly, and it was even more deadly, 95% fatal if untreated. It came on suddenly. Fever, chest pain, coughing fits that brought up blood. Victims literally drowned in their own fluid-filled lungs. And pneumonic plague had another horrifying quality. It could spread directly from person to person, carried in droplets, coughed into the air. A mother's love became deadly. A priest hearing confession could condemn himself with his compassion. Anyone close enough to comfort the dying risked becoming the next victim. The third form, septicemic plague, was mercifully rare, but almost always fatal. The bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, bypassing the lymph nodes entirely. Victims might seem healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Their extremities turned black as blood vessels collapsed. It was as if death simply claimed them without warning. Medieval physicians had never seen anything like it. They recorded symptoms meticulously, desperately seeking patterns, trying to understand. But they had no knowledge of bacteria, no concept of disease vectors, no understanding of the invisible war being waged inside their patients' bodies. In the 14th century, medicine was based on the theory of humorism, the belief that health depended on balancing the body's 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Physicians believed the plague was caused by a corruption of the air, a miasma of bad vapors rising from rotting matter, or released by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. This theory wasn't entirely wrong. They correctly identified that the disease seemed to cluster around filth and decay. They just didn't understand the actual mechanism, that it was rats and fleas, not bad air, carrying death through the streets. Contemporary reports speak of strange atmospheric phenomena before plague outbreaks. Unusual colors in the sky, strange fogs, overwhelming stenches. These descriptions might have been attempts to make sense of the incomprehensible, or they might have been real. Volcanic eruptions did occur in this period, and their effects on climate might have contributed to the disease's spread. The treatments physicians prescribed were based on their understanding of humoral medicine. Bloodletting was common, the belief being that releasing corrupted blood would restore balance. They administered purgatives to expel bad humors through the bowels. They prescribed complex combinations of herbs: theriac, a ancient cure-all; bole armeniac, a red clay; crushed emeralds for those wealthy enough to afford them. They recommended patients avoid bathing believing that open pores allowed corrupted air to enter the body. They advised smelling strong scents, vinegar, roses, even excrement, to ward off the miasma. They burned aromatic woods and herbs in public squares. Some treatments bordered on the absurd, sitting in sewers, on the theory that one stench would drive out another, drinking molten gold, eating arsenic, applying live chickens to buboes, believing the birds would draw out the poison. The famous plague doctor costume, the long wax-coated robe, leather gloves, and beaked mask stuffed with aromatic herbs, wouldn't actually appear until later plague outbreaks in the 16th and 17th centuries. In 1347, doctors wore their ordinary clothing, often richly decorated, a sign of their professional status. Many of these physicians died alongside their patients, their knowledge and compassion proving no defense against a foe they couldn't see. As the death toll mounted and traditional medicine failed, people turned to more desperate measures. They made pilgrimages to holy shrines. They bought indulgences and relics. They flagellated themselves in public, believing their suffering might appease an angry God. Some communities, in their desperation and fear, turned to scapegoating Jewish communities, were accused of poisoning wells, a terrible lie that led to massacres in German towns and elsewhere. These atrocities occurred despite papal bulls condemning such violence, despite the obvious fact that Jewish communities were dying of plague at the same rate as Christians. The truth was simpler and more terrifying than any conspiracy. No one knew what caused the plague. No one knew how to stop it, and no one knew if anyone would survive. All they could do was tend to the dying, bury the dead, and pray that tomorrow wouldn't bring the telltale fever that marked them as the next victims. Imagine waking one morning to find your street empty. Not quiet, empty. No merchants calling out their wares, no children playing, no neighbors gossiping at their doors. Just silence and the occasional sound of sobbing from behind closed shutters. This became the reality across Europe in 1348 and 1349. Cities that had bustled with life for centuries turned into ghost towns almost overnight. Markets that had operated since Roman times simply ceased. Shops stood abandoned, their goods rotting on shelves. Workshops fell silent. No hammers on anvils, no looms clicking, no ovens baking the daily bread. When plague entered a household, the authorities marked the door with a painted cross and the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." It was a warning to stay away, and a death sentence for those inside families were sealed in with their dying members, left to care for them alone, knowing they would likely be next. Food became scarce, not because there wasn't enough, but because the mechanisms of distribution collapsed. Farmers abandoned their fields mid-harvest, fleeing to the countryside in the hope that open air was safer than crowded towns. Grain rotted in storehouses because there was no one to transport it. Livestock wandered free after their owners died, and there was no one to claim them. The few bakeries that remained open rationed their bread. Butchers' stalls stood empty. Fish rotted at the docks because there weren't enough healthy workers to unload the boats. And the boats themselves came less frequently. Sailors knew that every port might be a plague port, every voyage a potential death sentence. Those who could flee did. Nobles retreated to their country estates, bringing the disease with them. Monks abandoned their monasteries. Teachers closed their schools. Judges suspended courts. The apparatus of governance simply stopped functioning in many places. And yet, life had to continue somehow. Someone had to bury the dead. Someone had to care for the orphans. Someone had to keep some semblance of order. These duties fell to the brave, the desperate, or those who had already survived the plague and believed themselves immune. Grave diggers became among the most important and most feared members of society. They worked in crews, loading bodies onto carts, hauling them to mass graves outside city walls. The work was so dangerous that cities had to offer enormous wages. Some grave diggers made more in a month than a craftsman made in a year. But most didn't live long enough to spend their earnings. In normal times, death was an intimate affair. The dying were surrounded by family. Priests came to hear final confessions and administer last rites. Bodies were washed and prepared with care. Funerals were occasions for the community to gather, to mourn, to remember. The plague made all of this impossible. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. In Florence, the historian Agnolo di Tura wrote of fathers abandoning their sick sons, wives leaving dying husbands, siblings fleeing from siblings. Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, he recorded. For this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. When graveyards filled, cities dug massive pits, trenches deep enough to hold hundreds of bodies, layered like lasagna, as contemporary accounts grimly described it. Quicklime was scattered between layers to speed decomposition and reduce the stench. Still, the smell of death hung over cities like a physical presence. In Avignon, where the papal court resided, so many died so quickly that Pope Clement VI consecrated the entire Rhone River so that bodies could be thrown into it and still receive Christian burial. The river, it was said, ran thick with corpses for months. Some communities simply gave up on individual burials. Bodies were piled in churches until the churches themselves became charnel houses. In rural areas, entire villages were abandoned, their dead left where they fell. Years later, travelers would come across these ghost settlements, doors hanging open, skeletons still sitting at tables or lying in beds. The psychological impact of this mass death is hard to overstate. Medieval society was deeply connected to rituals of death and burial. The dead were meant to be prayed for, remembered, integrated into the spiritual life of the community. Proper burial wasn't just tradition. It was believed to be necessary for the soul's journey to heaven. When these rituals became impossible, it shook people's fundamental understanding of their world. If God allowed the righteous to die without sacraments, if prayers went unanswered, if the innocent died alongside the guilty, what did it mean? The economic consequences rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in water. With a third of the population gone, labor became suddenly, dramatically scarce. Fields went unplowed. Vineyards went untended. Sheep wandered the hillsides with no shepherds to shear them. Entire industries ground to a halt because the craftsmen who had spent decades mastering their trades were dead, and there was no one trained to replace them. In England, the price of labor doubled, then tripled. Peasants who had worked the same land for generations, bound by feudal obligations, discovered they could demand wages. Lords who had ruled through tradition and force of habit found themselves negotiating with common farmers. The nobility tried to resist. They passed laws fixing wages at pre-plague levels. They threatened punishment for any worker who demanded more. But you can't enforce laws when half your enforcers are dead. Labor had become valuable in a way it never had been before, and workers knew it. Crime surged in some places, collapsed in others. In cities with no functioning government, looters picked through abandoned homes. But in many communities, people pulled together. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now relied on each other for survival. Strangers took in orphaned children. The bonds of necessity created new kinds of community. Yet there was also terrible cruelty. As fear mounted and deaths multiplied, some communities turned on their most vulnerable members. In Germany, Jewish communities were massacred by mobs, convinced they had caused the plague. Thousands died in pogroms in Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne, murdered not by disease, but by their neighbors' fear and hatred. Pope Clement VI issued bulls in 1348 and 1349 condemning these massacres, pointing out that Jews were dying of plague at the same rates as Christians. But his words had little effect in communities gripped by terror and looking for someone to blame. In some regions, law and order simply ceased to exist. Prisoners walked out of jails because there were no guards. Contracts went unfulfilled because one or both parties were dead. Debts went uncollected. Inheritance disputes multiplied as entire family lines died out, leaving property without clear owners. And through it all, the plague continued its march. It reached Sweden in 1350. It touched Iceland. It spread east into Russia. It circled back on itself, reinfecting areas that thought they had survived. This wasn't a single wave, but wave after wave, year after year, each one killing a little more, eroding a little more of what had been. The world as medieval people had known it was ending, but they didn't know yet what would rise in its place. In the medieval mind, all earthly events had spiritual causes. If crops failed, it was God's punishment for sin. If a child was born deformed, it was a sign from heaven. If plague struck, it must be divine judgment. But judgment for what? This was the question that tormented medieval Christians as the plague raged. The Church taught that suffering was redemptive, that God chastened those he loved. But the Black Death seemed indiscriminate. It killed the pious and the wicked alike. Monks who devoted their lives to prayer died as quickly as common sinners. Entire monasteries were wiped out. Churches that should have been sanctuaries became tombs. Perhaps most devastating, priests began to refuse to hear confession or administer last rites. The holy men who were supposed to guide souls to heaven now fled in terror, choosing their own lives over the spiritual needs of their flock. This wasn't universal. Many clergy died serving their communities, but it happened often enough to shatter trust. When prayers went unanswered, when sacraments didn't protect, when the clergy abandoned their posts, people began to question everything. If this was God's will, what kind of God allowed such suffering? If it wasn't God's will, then who or what was in control? Some doubled down on their faith, interpreting the plague as a call to deeper devotion. They saw it as God testing his people, separating the righteous from the damned. They prayed harder, fasted longer, made more generous donations to the church. Others went the opposite direction. If the end was near, and many believed it was, then what was the point of piety? Contemporary accounts describe an explosion of hedonism, people drinking and feasting in plague-stricken cities, living moment to moment because there might not be a tomorrow. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, became more than a saying. It became a way of life for those who had lost all hope in a better future in this world or the next. Into this spiritual crisis came the flagellants, groups of penitents who believed they could appease God's wrath through public self-punishment. They appeared first in Eastern Europe, then spread west, moving from town to town in organized groups. Dressed in white robes marked with red crosses, they would enter a town singing hymns and proceed to the market square. There, before crowds of onlookers, they would strip to the waist and whip themselves. Not symbolic whipping, but actual, brutal self-flagellation. They used leather scourges studded with iron points. They beat themselves until their backs were raw and bloody. They believed that by taking God's punishment upon themselves, they could save their communities. Some historians estimate there were as many as 800,000 flagellants moving through Europe at the height of the movement. Entire villages would turn out to watch. Some joined in. Others saw it as a sign that the end times had truly arrived. The flagellants followed strict rules. They traveled for 33 days, 1 day for each year of Christ's life. They whipped themselves 3 times daily. They slept on hard ground and ate only donated food. They were to show no emotion during their scourging, no matter how much pain they felt. Initially, the church was uncertain how to respond. Some clergy supported them, seeing their penance as genuine devotion. But as the movement grew, it became more radical. Flagellants began claiming they didn't need priests or sacraments. They said their suffering was enough to wash away sin. This was heresy. By 1349, Pope Clement VI had seen enough. He issued a bull condemning the flagellants and ordering authorities to suppress the movement. Many were arrested. Some were executed. The movement faded as quickly as it had appeared, but it left a mark on the medieval psyche. People had seen neighbors take salvation into their own hands. They had witnessed the church declare this insufficient. The gap between institutional religion and popular piety was widening, a crack that would eventually split Western Christianity itself. The plague left its mark not just on bodies and societies, but on art and culture. Before the Black Death, medieval art had been largely optimistic. Religious paintings showed radiant saints and glorious heavens. Death was depicted as a transition, a doorway to eternal life. Suffering was meaningful, redemptive, temporary. After the plague, art turned dark. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became one of the most popular artistic themes across Europe. These works showed death personified as a skeleton, dancing with people of all social classes, popes and peasants, knights and merchants, children and elderly. The message was clear. Death comes for everyone. Rank and wealth offer no protection. Churches commissioned elaborate danse macabre murals. They served as memento mori, reminders of mortality, but also as social levelers. In death, the king and the beggar were equals. The hierarchy that seemed so important in life meant nothing in the grave. Literature changed too. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the aftermath of plague-ravaged Florence, featured young nobles fleeing to a country villa to wait out the epidemic. They passed the time telling stories, often bawdy, irreverent tales that would have been scandalous before the plague. The book reflects a world where old certainties have crumbled. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in England several decades after the first outbreak, shows a society still processing the trauma. His pilgrims represent all levels of society, traveling together in ways that would have been unusual before the plague. Even fashion changed. The concept of memento mori jewelry emerged. Rings and pendants decorated with skulls and bones, worn as reminders that life is fleeting. The wealthy began commissioning transy tombs, double-decker monuments showing their idealized image on top and their corpse, often crawling with worms, below. These weren't morbid curiosities. They were attempts to process unimaginable trauma, to find meaning in mass death, to remind the living that every moment mattered, because it might be the last. The Black Death had fundamentally changed how Europeans thought about life, death, God, and their place in the universe. The medieval worldview, with its rigid hierarchies and confident certainties, had been shaken to its core. But from these ashes, something new was beginning to grow. In 1350, if you had told a medieval nobleman that within a century the entire feudal system would be crumbling, he would have laughed. Feudalism had existed for nearly 1,000 years. It seemed as permanent as the seasons, as unchangeable as the stars. The Black Death changed everything. Before the plague, Europe had too many people for its agricultural capacity. Land was valuable. Labor was cheap. A lord could replace any peasant who demanded better treatment. Farmers had no bargaining power. They worked the land they were born on, under conditions set by tradition and enforced by law. Then a third of the workforce vanished. Suddenly, there weren't enough workers to harvest the fields. Land that had been tilled for generations returned to wilderness lords who had once commanded dozens of tenant farmers, now struggled to find any workers at all. And the workers who remained knew they were valuable. For the first time in centuries, common farmers could say no. They could leave a manor where they were mistreated and find work elsewhere. They could demand wages instead of laboring for free. They could negotiate the terms of their service. The nobility tried desperately to maintain the old order. England's Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to fix wages at pre-plague levels. France and other countries enacted similar laws. But laws on parchment meant nothing when reality had changed so dramatically. If a lord refused to pay fair wages, his fields went unplowed. If he tried to force his peasants to work, they simply left. And there was no way to stop them when every neighboring manor was desperate for workers and willing to offer better terms. Real wages in Europe increased dramatically. A laborer in 1400 could afford a standard of living that would have been impossible for his great-grandfather. Diets improved. Housing improved. Children had opportunities their parents never had. This wasn't immediate, and it wasn't universal. There were setbacks and regional variations. In some areas, lords managed to maintain their power through violence and intimidation. In England, increased oppression led to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a massive uprising that was ultimately crushed, but which showed that common people could challenge authority in ways that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. But the overall trend was clear. The bonds of feudalism were loosening. Social mobility, once almost impossible, became achievable. The grandson of a peasant might become a merchant. The son of a craftsman might attend university. The rigid hierarchy that had defined medieval society was giving way to something more fluid, more dynamic, more modern. Image: medieval monastery scriptorium, monks studying texts. Medieval medicine had failed spectacularly against the plague. But from that failure came the first stirrings of modern medical thinking. Physicians who had watched their treatments prove useless began questioning ancient authorities. For centuries, medical knowledge had been based on texts by Galen and Hippocrates, written more than 1,000 years earlier. These works were treated as infallible. If Galen said bloodletting was the answer, bloodletting was the answer. But Galen had never seen the Black Death. His theories offered no explanation, no cure, no comfort. Some doctors began advocating for observation over authority. They started keeping detailed records of symptoms, trying to identify patterns. They compared outcomes of different treatments. These were baby steps, but they represented a fundamental shift. Evidence might matter more than tradition. The plague also led to the development of public health measures. Italian city-states pioneered the concept of quarantine. From quaranta, the Italian word for 40, the number of days ships were required to wait before docking. Venice established the first quarantine station on an island in 1423. Cities appointed health boards to enforce sanitation regulations. They hired street cleaners. They regulated butchers and tanners, keeping smelly and potentially disease-causing businesses away from residential areas. They began requiring burial outside city walls. These measures weren't based on understanding bacteria or disease vectors. That knowledge was still centuries away. But they were based on observation. Plague seemed to spread through contact, seemed to cluster around filth and decay, so limiting contact and improving cleanliness might help. It did help, though not as much as people hoped. The plague would return again and again over the next 3 centuries, though never with the same devastation as the first outbreak. Each recurrence taught more lessons, prompted more innovations. Medical schools expanded. Universities in Italy, France, and England increased their focus on practical medicine. The process of dissection, long restricted by religious prohibition, gradually became more accepted as a way to understand anatomy. The transformation of medicine from a largely theoretical discipline based on ancient texts to an empirical science grounded in observation, a transformation that would define the modern world, began in the shadow of the plague pits. It seems paradoxical. The worst catastrophe in human history helped spark one of history's greatest cultural flowerings. But the connection between the Black Death and the Renaissance is real. With so much wealth concentrated in fewer hands, survivors inheriting from multiple deceased relatives, there was money for patronage. Rich merchants in Italian cities became great sponsors of art and learning. They commissioned paintings, sculptures, and buildings that would define the Renaissance style. The plague had also created a spiritual and intellectual crisis that demanded new answers. The old certainties had failed. Maybe, people thought, there was wisdom to be found in the ancient world before Christianity, before feudalism. Scholars began rediscovering and translating classical Greek and Roman texts. This revival of classical learning, humanism, emphasized human potential and achievement rather than divine will and original sin. It didn't reject Christianity, but it added a new dimension. Maybe humans could understand their world through reason. Maybe individual achievement mattered. Maybe this life, not just the afterlife, was worth celebrating. The printing press, invented around 1440 by Johannes Gutenberg, accelerated these changes. Ideas that once would have remained confined to a single monastery could now spread across Europe. Knowledge became democratized in a way that would have been impossible in the pre-plague world. The plague also disrupted old artistic patterns. So many master artists died that traditional workshop systems broke down. Young artists had more freedom to experiment, less obligation to follow rigid guild rules. This creative freedom shows in the innovations of Renaissance art. And there was a new urgency to creation. If death could come so suddenly, so arbitrarily, then every moment must be seized. Artists worked with a passion born of mortality. Memento mori went from meaning remember you will die to remember you are alive. The Renaissance didn't happen because of the plague. Correlation isn't causation, but the plague created conditions that made it possible. Concentrated wealth, intellectual crisis, social mobility, a willingness to question authority, and a heightened awareness of human mortality. From the darkest moment of medieval civilization came light. not immediately, not everywhere, but gradually, persistently. A new world was being born from the ruins of the old. The Black Death ended, but its echoes never quite faded. Plague returned to Europe again and again in the 1360s, the 1370s, periodically through the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment. The last major European outbreak was the Great Plague of London in 1665, which killed perhaps 100,000 people. Marseille suffered a final epidemic in 1720. Then, gradually, the disease retreated. Why did it finally end? We're still not entirely certain. Improvements in sanitation helped. So did changes in housing, replacing thatched roofs and wooden floors with tile and brick, creating fewer habitats for rats. The spread of brown rats, which carry fewer plague-infected fleas than black rats, might have played a role. Modern medicine didn't solve the plague so much as the plague finally released its grip on Europe. Today, scientists can extract DNA from plague victims buried in medieval mass graves. They can sequence the genome of the bacterium that killed millions. They can trace its evolution, understand its mutations, see how it spread. This knowledge came too late to save medieval Europeans. But it reminds us that we're still vulnerable. Yersinia pestis still exists. Small outbreaks occur occasionally, usually in rural areas of Asia and Africa. With modern antibiotics, it's easily treatable, if caught early. The real lesson of the Black Death isn't about bacteria or medicine. It's about resilience. Medieval society faced something that seemed like the end of the world. And it wasn't the end. Humans adapted. They survived. They eventually thrived. Every person listening to these words is here because someone, somewhere in your family tree, survived the Black Death. Think about that. Your existence is proof that humanity endures. The plague taught medieval Europeans that the world could change in ways they never imagined. That lesson echoes through history to us. Civilizations are more fragile than we think, but people are stronger than we know. Rest well. The darkness always passes, and morning somehow always comes.